This is part 2 of the introduction to Adobe Camera Raw for SIT. And I'm going to be looking at noise reduction to begin with. And in order to do this, I'm going to open up a new image, which is in fact an old image, but with some added noise. So you'll see at the top here that that's quite grainy now. So I've added some noise into that image. And we're going to open this up in Camera Raw and see what we can do about it. So let's just close everything down. And I want to draw your attention firstly to this button at the bottom of the screen, because when we hit that, we get the opportunity to see a before and after view. Now they're identical at the moment because I haven't applied any new editing. But let's just blow these up and you'll begin to see a lot more of the noise at that size. So we deal with noise under the Detail tab, and if we open that up, we can see three options: sharpening, noise reduction, and color noise reduction. So let's deal with sharpening first. And you may say, well, how is that different to clarity? And that would be a good question. We dealt with clarity under the Basic tab, and clarity deals with the contrast in the mid-tones. So it's quite specific in an image, whereas sharpening increases the contrast between the dark and light tones in an image. So it'll have more of an overall effect. Now, for each of these options, we have another button at the right which opens some further controls which become available as soon as we start moving the first slider. And that's the case for each of these three options. So let's deal with sharpening first. We have a radius control, and as I said, as we move it, that becomes available. Now, radius is going to increase the number of pixels selected to work on. So as you move up the scale, a greater number of pixels will be selected. The detail slider at the lower end will focus on edges in your image. And we should be able to see this as we increase the detail. You may notice that that edge between the two shades of grey, it has become more defined. And in fact, if I increase the sharpening, you can just about see that beginning to have an effect. Now, the problem with sharpening on this image that already has grain in it is that we're actually making it worse. We're sharpening the grain. So you have to consider what image that you're working with. If you have an image with grain in it or noise, I would be dealing with the noise reduction first. And what that can do is add a little bit of softness to the image. So then you want to sharpen. However, if you've got an image that requires some sharpening, you might want to apply some sharpening first, but you might find then in doing that, that introduces some grain. So then you want to deal with the noise. So it's probably not a great idea to deal with sharpening first, except that we're going through what these sliders would do. So the last one, masking, actually isolates the areas I've mentioned before. So at the lower end, it will isolate the edges of shapes in your image to be able to then apply sharpening. And at the other end, it will affect the whole image. So that is the sharpening option. So when we look at noise reduction, we're actually specifically talking about luminance noise. Now, luminance noise is a random brightness that a camera can introduce into an image, and it's something that you want to reduce wherever possible. The other option, colour noise reduction, introduces what's called a chroma noise, which is a noise that affects the colour values, and can introduce colour artifacts into an image. So let's go back to noise, and as we increase the slider for noise reduction, we might begin to see that there's some improvement. We can certainly see some improvement in the 50% grey area from the aftershot back to before the editing, and we can increase detail and contrast, and as we do that we might also begin to see a stronger edge between the 40% and 50% values on the screen. So let's try reducing that back down to 0 and introduce some colour noise reduction. Looking at noise reduction further and just scrolling down through this image, we can perhaps see it more clearly in the lady's face. So we've got a bit of a sharpening applied here, which perhaps we can take down a little bit. But when we look at noise reduction, just to observe the face, and when we begin to increase our sliders, you can see the difference between the before and after version. So it's really helping that graininess. We can go a bit further with this and look at the colour noise reduction slider. So just increasing that a bit, I think the effect is going to be quite subtle in this case, but the detail slider is really preserving the edges, particularly at when we get up to 100. But at that level, it can start to increase some colour speckles. So it's always best to use it sparingly. At the lower end, whilst you don't get so many colour speckles, you can find that colours bleed into each other slightly. So there's always a balance between using these sliders, and it's essential to look at the image that you're working on, because one size certainly doesn't fit all. You've got to adjust the sliders to correspond with the image that you're working on and the amount of noise that's in that image. Let's now have a look at the Colour Mixer tab. If we open that up, we see we've got some controls over HSL, so hue, saturation and luminance. So just to be clear, when we talk about hue, we're talking about colour. When we're talking about saturation, we're talking about how deep or strong that colour is. And with luminance, we're talking about how much white or black is mixed with those colours. And we can see that happening as we look at these sliders. So with the reds, for instance, if I increase the reds, we see on this slider that it increases in colour from a red to more in the magentas. And looking at the headscarf on this lady, we can see that now there's a lot more magenta in that red. Double click the arrow to recenter it, and the other way goes to orange. And that's the case for all of these. We can see on those gradations of colour, orange goes more towards red on the left and more towards yellow on the right. So we have complete control over the colour content in our images. When we look at saturation, remembering that this is how deep or how strong the colour is, again, these gradations show us that if we desaturate the reds, they're going to go more to greys and suck the colour out of it. So we've got some control there over how strong our colours are, and often colours may need to be just oversaturated a little bit, or just increase of the saturation, particularly if you're photographing, for instance, maybe birds, and you want to just make the colours stand out a little bit more. But keep in mind that for something like wildlife photography, you want a natural look. So whilst you might want to give the colours a little more emphasis, you still want to keep them looking natural. So that should be fairly clear how each one of those work. Each one on the left goes to grey and is desaturated, and on the right increases the saturation. So then we look at luminance, and again these gradations show us what is happening. So with the red, and as I mentioned with luminance, it's how much black or white is mixed with the colour. So looking at the reds, we can darken those reds, and you see again on the headscarf it's more of a burgundy colour perhaps, but it's losing some of the detail as well. Keep that in mind. And going the other way, we'll be able to lighten that red, but that's also sucking the colour out of it as well. So we've got some control there. Finally, we've got this all button, and that just simply shows all the three options for HSL in one view. So it just depends on how you like to work, really. On this menu, we've also got a colour option, but this is again doing the same thing, and it's just a different way of working, but doing the same thing. So for the red button, we've got hue, and we can increase that more towards magentas, doing exactly the same thing as if we have HSL selected. So it's just a different way of presenting that data and controlling that data. Lastly, we've got, let's go back to HSL. We've got the Hue Targeted Adjustment tool, and that works in a similar way to other targeted adjustment tools that we've used. So we can see that if we click and drag, we get a sliding scale from greens to purples, and we can see that being adjusted on the sliders. And that depends on where we're clicking on the image. So if I click on the red, we get more of a magenta to orange control. So you've got to remember where to click on the image, and that's really why it's called a targeted adjustment tool. So that's colour mixing. Let's move now down to having a look at colour grading. And this used to be called split toning in Camera Raw. So if you're wondering where the split toning options are, now called colour grading. So let's open this up. And you'll notice to begin with that when we mouse over the panel, those three colour wheels are highlighted. Now there are some, we've got this adjust menu. There are some different ways of displaying the same information. It makes it look more complicated than it actually is, but we can display these colour wheels all together, and if we mouse over that, it tells us that's the three-way view. Or we can focus in on the shadows, so click on the button and we just see the shadow colour wheel. And we can click through the midtones or the highlights in the same way. If I go back to the shadows, if you wanted to click on the side of the colour wheel, you can just skip across doing that as well. So let's go back to the three-way view. Again, I can click on the titles and select those as well. So what we're looking at with each of these colour wheels is a way of selecting hue, saturation and luminance. So if I move this center button out to the top, let's say into the greens, when it's as far as it can go, that it is a fully saturated green, and as we move it back down towards the center, it becomes desaturated. Now if you want to get any of these controls back to the center, just double click them, and if we go to the outside hue selector, double click that, we'll zero all the values. Now at the bottom of each one, each color wheel I should say, if we select a color, we've got our luminance control, adding blacks or whites into that same color. And just centering that again. We also have an eye icon that appears as we mouse over it. So if we've made a change, and we can see that on our test screen, if we mouse over the eye icon and hold it down, we can see a before and after view. So let's have a look at in more detail at what these can do. And I just want to introduce you to some keyboard shortcuts too. If when you've made a color selection on a Mac, hold down the Command key, and on a PC that would be the Control key, you see we get, and let's just move that down a little, you see we get a way of locking in where we are on that color wheel. So I'm holding down the Command key or the Control key as I do that, and when I release it, release the Command key, that will disappear. So that's a useful way of locking in exactly the colors that we've chosen. We can also use the Shift key, and notice when I use the Shift key we get a direct line of saturation, so we can move up and down that and lock that saturation value in for that green color. Now what I'll show you on this test screen, particularly where we've got the gradation of greys, which are now looking very green, let's just remove that and go back to how it was. So we've got this grey graduation here. So I can show you perhaps for the shadows, which is going to be at the darker end, if we made those shadows blue, you can see now what that's doing to that gradation of grey. If we then made the midtones perhaps green, you can see that's now introducing the green to that gradation. And for the highlights, let's go to red. So we can see how that's affecting those shades of grey. So let's just point out the two options below, the blending and balance options. Because if we move the blending slider to the left, and notice what that does to the gradation of colour. I'm just using that just to check that it is actually working, and it certainly is. So the more we move it to the right, the more the colours are actually blended more. So we're actually losing the midtones as we move it to the right. Blending it the other way, the colours are blended less, so we see that actually those colours are still more defined. So if we sit it in the centre, that's a balance between the two. And just using the balance, this is defining where those tones actually fall. So it's a question of playing with how these look and selecting exactly where you want to set those. So just double clicking those again will center those to 0. Another way of doing that resetting as well, I'll just point out, is if we hold the Option key down, you'll notice that for all of these tabs, we get a reset option. So with the option key held down, if I then click the title, that will set all the values back to the original settings. One other thing I'll point out while we're looking at color grading is that when we focus in on one of these color wheels, so let's take the midtones for instance, underneath we have the luminance option, but we have this pointer as well that if we click on gives us hue, saturation and luminance controls specifically for the midtones. Now we're going to have a look at the optics tab, and in order to do this I've opened up a new image that will help us. And just before I continue with this, I just want to point out that this Camera Raw window is sitting over the top. It's a floating window over the top of my Photoshop window, so as you can see Photoshop is underneath there, and we are seeing a bit of the Photoshop menu on the right there. And I'm hoping that's not confusing anybody, so we can drag that just to cover that, if that makes that clearer. So with optics, to begin with, we have a distortion control. So it may be, particularly if perhaps we're photographing buildings, that we've got some lens distortion, and this will just help to deal with any of that. There are some other ways when we get into geometry that we can do that as well, but double clicking will just recenter that. Now we also have a vignette option for correcting the vignetting that you can get in most lenses. Most often this is noticeable in wide angle lenses, and moving to the left will darken the edges, but since they're already darker, really moving to the right would be a better option to lighten those corners and edges of the image. So moving to the right will just lighten those up. Now if we click this pointer, we have a control over the midpoint as well in our vignette. These vignetting controls are there to deal specifically with or correct the vignetting that can be caused by lenses, particularly wide-angled lenses. There's another option for vignetting or adding a vignette to an image that you'll find in the Effects tab, and this is where we can add a vignette for artistic effect. Then one more control under Optics, we have a defringe option, and if we open up this, this is particularly why I've chosen this image to work on. Now we may get some chromatic aberrations or fringing in our images, so these give us some unwanted colours, and I'll show you an example of this as we zoom in. You'll see down the edges of the trees we've got some purple colours coming in and around the leaves. So we have a purple control on the defringe option, and that's likely to deal with that. So as I bring that down, you'll see that that purple on the edges of the trees is disappearing. And those colours can also be reds and greens, and so we've got controls over all of those. Now there's not so much of that going on in this image. It may be that there's some blues, but mainly the purples, and that in fact moving that slider has brought the purples back slightly, so let's leave that there. But you'll need to look at your image and adjust according to what issues you have if you need to deal with them. So that's the defringe option. Now we're going to have a look at the Geometry tab, and in order to do that I've just skipped back into Photoshop because I want to open a new file. So I'm going to go to File, Open, but I'm actually going to open two files. So I'm going to open these two files at once. They're both RAW files. So when you open a RAW file, it will automatically open in Camera Raw, and it will also give you the film strip, which is the thumbnail images at the bottom. Now if you open multiple images, you'll have them all listed across the bottom, and you can skip between them very easily. If you want to lay the film strip out horizontally, or sorry, vertically, horizontally at the moment, but vertically on the left hand side. If you control click, I know it's off the screen, but there is a vertical option there that you can change that to. We've also got some controls here for we can, if we've got a whole bunch of images and some of them we don't want, we can mark them for deletion and it will immediately delete them when we close Camera Raw down. So the image I've got open here is the Ravensbourne Stores image, and this is from week 2 on NZDP 101. And you're going to be asked to do a few things with this image, and one of the things will be straightening up these verticals, and the Geometry tab is a great place to do that. Now you might want to work on images with the Geometry tab in conjunction with Optics. Well, we've already looked at the manual controls for distortion, and some of that you may need to look at first. But the Geometry tab gives us lots more control over how our images are looking. So first of all, we've got a set of presets at the top, and we can use this. So the first one, the A symbol, which is Apply Balance Perspective Corrections. If I click that, it automatically straightens up those walls. So I would recommend doing that manually because you've got more control, but that's a preset to do that. Now you'll notice obviously we've got now some areas that need to be cropped. Well, if we undo what we've just done and set the Constrain Crop checkbox, do the same thing, you'll see there it's now straightened up the walls and cropped it in closer as well. Now you'll notice though that those walls, if you compare them to the side of the image, are not entirely straight. So this is why we perhaps would prefer to do that manually. Now as we go across, we've got some other options. We can adjust the level automatically. So if we've got a horizon line, perhaps we've got a seascape, and we've got a horizon line that's not quite straight, that will straighten that up for us. And we've got some other options there that do similar things in terms of presets. At the end of this set of presets, we've got the Draw Guides option, which opens up these additional controls. And you see here we've got a Draw Guides button. Now when we select that, I can actually draw in a guide to an upright or a line that's on my image, and I put a second one in this side and just match it up to the wall, and it will straight away straighten those up. Now as you can see, it's still not perfectly square to the edge of the image, so let's undo that. And just before I go on, let's just do that once more, and I've undone one of the guides. I can switch the guides on and off here, and I can clear them here. Let's just do that once more. Put the guides in. And then that's going to do that automatically. And when I actually press the Draw Guides button, that is applying that. So if you just hit the clear guides, it will undo what you've just done. So applying that transformation, just click the Draw Guides button. So let's undo that again, because we're going to look now at the manual controls. Now, the one I would recommend using for your week 2 work is the vertical transformation, and straight away we get a grid to work to, which is useful. So we can straighten up the walls to exactly in line with the grid, and there it's pretty straight. Now don't forget, if you do that with the Constrain Crop box checked, it will then crop that bottom section out that we've lost. Double click to get back to where you were. So These sliders do varying things that you can have a look through. So we've got that kind of rotate across a horizontal axis. Then we've got the actual rotate around a center point. We've got an aspect ratio, so we're stretching or condensing, or stretching in both different ways. We've got a scale option, which is in some respects similar to crop, except that it's actually enlarging or reducing at the same time. And we can offset along a horizontal axis or a vertical one. So you've got those geometrical transformations under the Geometry tab. One other thing I'll just point out, if we've done a transformation or completed a transformation and we want to get back to where we were, another thing we can do is go to these three dots at the bottom of the tool palette and select, it's just off the screen, apologies for that, perhaps I can adjust to bring it in, and let's look again, let's do a little bit more. So we've got reset to default, and that will take you right back to before you did any editing on the image. Now let's have a look at the Effects tab, and to demonstrate this, let's go in a bit closer on the brickwork on this Ravensbourne store image. And under Effects, we have an option to control grain, or to add grain, I should say. And this may be appropriate if perhaps you're creating some kind of historical look to a photograph. You want to add some noise or grain into it. And that brickwork already has to some degree its own kind of grain, and we can increase that. And we've also got some options. In fact, while we're doing that, let's just do a before and after look by hitting the eye icon. So remember, you're holding the eye icon down, and we can see that's the before and that's the after. Now we've got some further controls where we can control the size of the grain and the roughness. So use those as you see fit with images you're working on. Then we've got another control for vignetting. Let's just zoom out of that. And Command 0 on a Mac and Control 0 on a PC will just reduce the image to fill the screen. So we've already had a look at vignetting up under Optics, but this vignetting option under Effects we've got more control over, because as you can see it's much more pronounced. So we can see that we've darkened the edges, we've got control over the midpoint, we can bring it in, we've even got control over how round that shape is, and also the feather. This is how quickly it fades. So if we take it right down to 0, we've got pretty much a hard line there, and we can vary that as much as we want. The other end will almost be not there. And then we can adjust highlights as well and bring that in a bit closer, a bit tighter. Lastly, we'll look at what the style menu does. And for highlight priority, this is going to protect the highlight contrast. So this can lead to color shifts in the darker areas of your image. But we also have an option for color priority. Now this preserves color, but this can also lead to a loss of detail. And lastly, we have paint overlay, and this is going to blend the original colors with black or white. So Again, experiment, see which one gives you the result or the effect that you're looking for. The last tab on the right is the calibration tab. And if we open that and have a look, we start off with the process drop-down menu, which allows us to select which version of Camera Raw will be used to process the raw data. Now, in most cases, you're going to want to leave it set to the current version. So I think you can ignore that menu other than that, but just make sure it is set to the current version. Then below here, we've got, first of all, a shadows slider. Now, this is useful if you've got perhaps a color cast over your image. Now, this is going to particularly adjust the colors in the shadow areas. And we've got a slider that goes from greens to purples. And we can perhaps see just about what that's doing by moving that. Then we've got 3 sliders for red, green and blue primary colours. And for each of these, they have their own hue and saturation selection. Now, so if I wanted to adjust, for instance, the red primary, this is going to adjust not just the reds in the image, but every other colour that contains any red in it. So for all of these sliders, it really is a global adjustment. So it's going to affect the whole of the image. So that's more so than some of the more specific tools we've looked at previously. So very useful for global corrections. Now let's have a look at some of our tools that we have available. Let's just resize the screen slightly. So at the bottom here, we've got the zoom tool, which is pretty clear what that does, and also the hand tool for navigating around our image. We've got a color dropper or sampler, and if we sample in an area, we then get the color values up the top. We can reset that by clicking over here on the left, and we've also got the same button there as well. So then going up to the top, this first button, which has also got a keyboard shortcut of E, so no command button, just E. Once we're in a different set of tools, so for instance, if I start to look at the masking tools by pressing M on the keyboard, if we want to get back to our standard set, we can press E on the keyboard or click that button and it'll get us back to the familiar tabs. So I'll come to the masking tools in a little while. Now let's have a look at the crop tool. So here we've got a set of aspect ratios. So we can choose a preset. So for instance, if we choose a 5:7 preset, it straight away crops our image to a 5:7, and we've already got this rule of thirds type grid into 9 sections for us to compose our image with. Now we can change that from a landscape aspect ratio to a portrait just by clicking this button here. So we go to a portrait crop. If we go back to original, and choose 5:7 again, we can unlock that or lock that. So that can be set in place for a number of images. If we've got, particularly if we've got a few images loaded into our film strip. Let's put it back to original. Now, you'll notice as we come out past the corners, which is also the case with the crop tool in Photoshop, that we are able to rotate. And if I crop that so that the building is on a severe slope there, let's go back to the crop. I can use this tool next to the angle tool, double click it, and it will automatically straighten it for us. I'm just going to double click to crop and just go to reset to default. So we've also got a tool for rotating with a slider, and we can put the values in there. Double click to reset, and back to the reset button at the top. That will reset our crop. And at the bottom, fairly obvious rotate tools and reflect tools, side to side and up and down. Let's have a look at the spot removal tool. So that's this third tool down. And to demonstrate this, let's just zoom in to the top of this building. And as we pass the cursor or the mouse over the screen, you see we've got a cursor which we can control the size of with the wheel on your mouse. Now we have an option for heal and clone. Now they both do quite similar things. Heal is going to replace one area of your image with similar pixels, whereas the clone tool will actually copy another area of your image into the new area. So slightly different criteria, but often it will create a very similar effect. We have a size control as well on the slider. We have a feather control, and it's just worth pointing out that when we increase the feather, that's shown on a cursor with the two rings. An outer dotted ring is the edge of the feather, and the inside ring being where it becomes solid. And so the more that we increase that, or the feather size I should say, the more that we increase that, we can see that the distance between those two rings is wider. And we can also control that by holding down the Shift and Control key on the keyboard on a Mac, and that would be the Shift and Control key on a PC as well, I think. And again, using the wheel on our mouse, and we can control the amount of feather, and you can see the slider moving at the same time. And we've also got an opacity control too. So let's just take the size of this down, and we'll take the feather down a bit as well. So we're on the heal option. If I click once, you'll notice we get a red dotted circle and a green dotted circle. The green being where I'm sampling from, and the red being where I'm sampling to. So you can see that that's replaced whatever that thing was in the corner. And if I just hop back to the, in fact I can hit E on the keyboard just to apply that. And that's already a pretty good edit without any further work needed. So just going back into the spot removal tool, the other option that we've got at the bottom, other than resetting, and we've got a before and after eye icon where we can see that rivet, whatever it is, appearing. We've also got a visualize spots checkbox. Now when we do that, we get to this kind of X-ray view, or a mask view perhaps, and the idea here is that it should highlight a lot more spots, particularly if they're white on black. They'll be a lot more easily seen. So you can use that option as well. Now let's have a look at the red eye correction tool. So that's this one over here, and we have, first of all, I've opened up a new image. So we've actually got an image with eyes. That's always useful to demonstrate this tool. And we've got a red eye or a pet eye option. So let's select the pet eye option, and the first thing we're going to do perhaps is increase the pupil size a bit. We have a button here to add a catch light or a highlight in the eye, and we've got an overlay button which I'll demonstrate shortly. So the first thing to do is select the eye but include some of the surrounding area so that the computer or the software can identify the eye. And then you've got a small area where it has identified that the eye needs to be edited. And as we pull that area over the pupil, we can see, if we switch off the overlay, we can see that that has been adjusted, and you'll see a tiny highlight in that eye as well, which we can switch off. There we go. With the checkbox. Let's just close that one down now. Close the red eye down, and underneath red eye we have some presets. So let's open that up, and we've got a bunch of presets here. Well, let's go for lifestyle. So if we open up lifestyle, as we mouse over these presets, we can see what they do to the image. So there's a whole bunch of different manipulations or transformations that we can do, and we can select those. So you can run through those as much as you like, but what I would recommend is that you get used to using Camera Raw and Photoshop to create your own effects rather than relying on click button sort of options like presets. One other thing which I have mentioned before is that are these three buttons at the bottom, which I'll just move the screen across to show. We have reset to default is the most useful one of those options. Now I'll just come back to my Ravensbourne Stores image, and one thing I want to point out before we get into looking at masking is that when we open a raw file, which is what this image is, we get at the bottom of the window some information which is the image information basically with the size, pixel size and pixel dimensions. And if we click on that, we see we get the Camera Raw preferences box open up, and it opens up on the workflow option. And I just want to draw your attention to this checkbox at the bottom, because we have an option to open in Photoshop as a smart object. Now we can do that from Photoshop, but we can also do that from Camera Raw, and we want to make sure that that is open so that that link between the two programs, or in fact it's the same program but two different modules of the same program, is in place, and we can skip back between the two. So when we go to Photoshop, you'll notice now here we have an open object, and that will open this image in Photoshop as a smart object. And we'll deal more with smart objects and what they are and what they can do in a later video. Right, there's two other things I particularly want to show you in Camera Raw, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Firstly, there are two keyboard shortcuts to be aware of. Now the first one is just M on your keyboard. So when we hit M, we come into the masking area of Camera Raw, and we've got some options for using masks and editing masks, and we also have a list of the keyboard shortcuts involved in finding those. So M is the first one to be aware of, and if you want to get back to the full tab menu on the right, you can do one or two things. Go back to the top button here, and it also gives you the keyboard shortcut, which is the other option. So if we just press E on a keyboard, we get back to the full tab menu. So the second option is pressing K on the keyboard, and if we go to K, we get some options for masking. And so really, I just want to draw your attention to these areas rather than going through them in great detail, because that's something we're going to cover later in the course, and there'll be some specific training tutorials on these areas. But some of the things we can do are setting up masks on our images and then editing those masks. We've got sliders here for working with a brush on a mask. And then we've got a bunch of other tabs down here for editing the areas that we've masked. So we can adjust exposure and all those other sliders that we've seen previously in Camera Raw, but this will just affect the areas that we've masked. So that's a really useful tool for editing specific areas of our images. The same with adjusting color, and we've got some texture, clarity and dehaze options there, and finally some noise adjustments in specific areas. So without going into too much detail, those are the controls for masking. The red button is the color of the mask, and if I just show you what that looks like, if we were painting on a mask on our image we have on the screen, we go to new mask. So we've got that selected already. We have let's increase the size of the brush, and there we have it. In fact, let's bring it down a little bit. So we start to mask an area out, and obviously I can spend a lot more time being a lot more accurate than I am now. So that red area that I'm painting is just the mask. So it's not applying red to the image, it's applying a mask that's indicated in red. Now you can actually change the color of that mask, and you do that by clicking the button here. So if red is not going to show you clearly the area that it's masked because of the color behind it, perhaps you can change the color there. So once you've masked that area, you can then start to apply specific edits to the area that you've got indicated. So that's roughly how it works, but I'm trying to avoid making these videos hugely long just to make sure that people are still awake out there. So I'm going to end this here, and we'll look at that in more detail in a later video. I'm just going to have a look at masking in a more recent version of Camera Raw, simply because one part of it has changed slightly. So if we went to the mask, you see that as we open up this new tab, it looks slightly different across the top. Now I've got a couple of images I've taken of some birds. We've got godwits and a black-winged stilt. Let's select the stilt, and we've got some automatic ways of making some selections. Now we've got one for sky, which, well, we haven't got a sky in this, so I'm not going to demonstrate that, but we have got a subject selection, and when we do that we see that instantly a mask is put over the subject. So Photoshop is identifying what the subject is and doing its best to isolate that. Now it's not done a great job because there's areas here and in between the tail and around the beak where it's not done a great job. So a lot of this will depend on what kind of contrast you have in your images, and this is why it's important to learn Photoshop without using presets and automatic functions where you can, so that you know how to adjust them where necessary. But it gives a pretty good job to start with. Now once I've got that selected, and let's say I've done some editing on that to improve that mask, and the mask incidentally is shown by this pink area over the bird, I could actually mask that further. In fact, let me do it a different way and show you another method as well. So if I go back and remove that mask, and instead we select the background. So it's possibly done a slightly better job of selecting the background, although it's still a bit of work to do in that tail feather area. But if I could go to subtract and choose a linear gradient and drag a gradient down, and now you can see that it's only masking the foreground area and adding a gradient in. So in effect I've added that to the mask. So I've got the bird masked out, or at least the background around the bird, plus I've now got a gradient on that background, and I could then go into perhaps my exposure area and darken that down, and you can see now that the foreground is darkening, the bird is masked out, and there's a fade on that mask as well. So that's a useful way of applying and adding to masks. And you can, in the same way, you can add all of these adjustments under light and also with color. And we've got the same kind of controls as we've seen in other areas of Camera Raw. One final thing I want to deal with is to talk briefly about smart objects and finish off how I mentioned that at the start of these Camera Raw tutorials. So I'm going to open up a file as a smart object. And let me just browse for my calibration image again. So if we open up the layers palette in Photoshop, we'll notice that because I've opened this as a smart object, it has the indication in the corner, the right hand corner of the layer thumbnail, and that small icon is a document icon, and that indicates that we have a smart object here. So if I now go into my Camera Raw filter, so I'm opening up the same image in Camera Raw, and maybe I do some kind of, let's think, a bit of color grading perhaps. So I'm going to add a bit of warmth to this calibration image. So now when I go to click OK, you'll see in Photoshop, attached to the layer that holds the calibration image are my filters. And if I double click on my Camera Raw filter, it opens it back up in Camera Raw, where I can do some further editing. Maybe I want to go for more of an orange, or no, let's go make it more obvious that there's a change. We'll go around to green. So I can go OK, and now we see that that's been applied in Photoshop. So there's the way that Photoshop and Camera Raw work really well together. Now if I needed to go back into Camera Raw again, obviously I can be doing some quite extensive editing here and be jumping back and forwards. If I wanted to revert back to how it was, I can go to reset to default, and then it's back to where it was. But those filters are retained, so I can continue to edit as much as I like. And this is a non-destructive editing process where we are able to always to get back to that original unedited image.